This is part 2 of our chapter 1 discussion, where we had talked about some of the basics to get started, and now we're going to start talking about our philosophical roots for psychology. So we had said last time that psychology is a relatively new science, simply because we only really started using the term psychology to refer to its own separate field of study, starting in about the 1870s when Wilhelm Wundt came onto the scene. Now, we'll talk about him quite a bit later in our more modern history of psychology, but of course we want to talk about some of these philosophical roots, all the stuff that came before we actually started calling it psychology. For those very distant roots, we had a whole bunch of philosophers and even early physiologists who had contributions that we can still trace into today's modern psychological ways of thinking. Now, first off, of course, we always go back to the Greek philosophers, individuals like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. They get mentioned in the history of biology and physics and so many other places, simply because they were philosophers that didn't really focus on any one aspect of thinking and philosophizing. But they asked a bunch of questions that we care about that were in regards to morality, the mind, and human nature in general. So just a really quick reminder, if you're not familiar with our Greek philosophers, they were active, if we see our dates here, from around 470 BC until sort of 322-ish BC. If I haven't mentioned it before, you're going to find that for us, the dates aren't really important. I don't test on dates, and really, I don't test on names either. I'd much rather that you understand sort of time periods relative to one another. So we know Greek philosophers were early, and say Wilhelm Wundt was much, much later. But other than that, the specific dates don't matter too much. We just need to know that there were philosophers that started us thinking about human nature and our minds very early on. So they were also looking at stuff that we talk about nowadays as part of Western philosophy. They got into lots of moral and ethical discussions. They talked about the form of the mind and things like that. But we're going to focus more on the more recent stuff. So enough about the philosophers. I also like pointing out that we had some very early physiologists who were looking at the physical anatomy of the brain, and they started looking at the connection to behavior. And specifically, at the bottom here, we have Al-Majusi was a Persian physicist physician, too many PHY words here. But they were a physician who was thought to be the first person to try and explain our psychological disorders as an illness. Now, this is something that really wasn't kept around in a lot of different cultures and didn't really make a reappearance until our more modern considerations of psychology, at least in terms of the details we're focusing on. And we have sort of some very approximate dates, but this is much, much later than our Greek philosophers in the sort of 900 mark AD. So quite a bit of variation there. And again, we're just touching on these to know they exist, but we're going to start focusing a lot more on things like we're getting into monism and dualism, which are the two sides of what you'll see called the mind-body problem. And this is sort of a fancy way to talk about the basic question of what's the nature of the human mind and how does it actually connect to our body, to our physical behaviors. And of course, if psychology is the study of behavior and the mind in some way, shape, or form, this understanding of this relationship is really, really important. So having this debate and talking about both sides of it is a great way to start. So if our mind is this intangible and fairly unobservable substance, how can we actually have psychology? How could we try and study it? And people are going to have different opinions here. Some people are even going to say that because it's intangible, it is unobservable, and therefore we can never understand it. Clearly not a great stance if we want psychology as a field to exist. So let's start with the people who have that opinion, that no, we can't study the mind. So this is our dualist perspective. And our famous dualist individual is René Descartes. And we'll see we still have some dates here, but we're jumping way ahead in time here. So the 1500s and 1600s. And Descartes had this opinion that our mind and our body are these two separate entities. So our mind is something that is intangible and non-physical, and therefore it is something completely unknowable. And in contrast, our body is a physical, observable, and completely separate entity. Descartes has a specific theory on how the two connect at one specific spot, which we'll get to in a moment. But this idea of having these two very different components that don't really have the same base ties into something called philosophical dualism. So we're still in that philosophy component. And this dualism opinion says that the mind and the body are different things. Now, this of course means that if they are different things and they have different backgrounds and they are made up of different stuff, we can't use our physical body to try and understand the mind, which, like I said, is really bad for psychology as a field. But we can also on occasion see a term called materialistic dualism, and I only mention this because it's something that pops up every once in a while. But this is basically saying the same thing as dualism, that the mind and the body are different, but they tack on a materialistic component that specifically says that the body is something that is physical. I don't love that they have to have a whole separate term for that. It gets folded fine with the other dualism perspectives, but I figured I'd show it to you in case, but you don't need to know it. Now, I did mention that Descartes had his own ideas about how this intangible mind and our consciousness, along with it, had a way of influencing our bodies. Because, of course, you can think about and intentionally do things like move your hand or say something that's coming out with intention. So there must be some way that our consciousness can make physical things happen. So for Descartes' idea, he credited this to our pineal gland. Now this is a really small gland. I can actually show a little diagram here, sort of towards the center of our brain. And he thought that this was a really important structure. The main reason why is because when you look at the brain, it exists in two mirrored hemispheres. They're pretty much the same on either side. But that means that for most of our structures, we have two mirrored structures that look the same. But there are a couple of rare structures that exist as only a single one along that midline of our brain. And the pineal gland happens to be one of these, where we only have a single structure. So he figured that singularity makes this a very important structure. And therefore, this must be where our intangible mind, where our consciousness can interact with our body and exert control on our actions. Nowadays, we of course know that our pineal gland is responsible for secreting melatonin. And melatonin, of course, is just a hormone that's going to help us regulate sleep and wakefulness. So not really that critical feature in allowing us to have consciousness and conscious control of our body. But at the time, with the limited knowledge that they had of how our brain structures worked, that's where we started from. Now, if I've been hinting that this idea of dualism isn't really going to work with our modern perspectives of psychology, then of course you can figure out that there is an alternative. And this is when we get the concept of monism. Now, if we look at the root words here, dualism, talking about two opposing sort of components or entities, our body and our mind, that's dual. There's two of them. So monism is probably going to be talking about a single entity. And our famous individual here is Thomas Hobbes, who very much argued against Descartes' idea of the mind and the body being separate. And he said instead, the mind is not a separate, intangible entity. It's actually just the product of our brain's physical actions. Of course, at this time, they didn't quite know how our neurons fire and how we produce all of those different action potentials in the brain, but there was an awareness that our brains were doing things, and the things that our brains did were tied to our mental components, how we think, how we choose to act. So that's where monism comes from. It's saying that our mind and our body are actually the same thing. Our body and our physical responses produce those mental components, so they're not actually separate entities, they are part of the same system. And this is hugely important for the field of psychology because this means that we could actually study our intangible mind by measuring actual physical processes. So, very, very important. And it also ties to another concept called philosophical materialism. And this specifically refers to the fact that those mental events that we experience are derived or produced by these physical events, typically talking about them within our brains. So we're tying these all together and having very specific names for them. Now, from all of this, with our different definitions, the big focus I want us to have here is on that distinction between monism and dualism and why it's really important that monism is something that exists, because that is our modern stance. Because, of course, we're going to look at how actions within our bodies, within our brains, are tied to those external actions we undergo, as well as our internal mental events as well. We, of course, do have other concepts to talk about, and you're going to notice this pattern where we have two almost opposing stances. So we started with our dualism versus monism, and we actually settled on monism as the perspective that we use today. With realism versus idealism, we're not necessarily going to have the same clear-cut definition or, I guess, decision at the end. But I suppose I should start by talking about the two concepts and our important figures for each. So we're starting with realism, which is important to have John Locke discussed. And John Locke was an English philosopher, and it was a lot of the philosophy focused on what it means for the world around us to be real and how we view that real world that surrounds us. So he also thought that philosophy as a field, as a whole, should be focusing on trying to understand the abilities and the extent of the human mind. Basically, he wanted to know, what is it that we're capable of? What can our minds do? And how many different things are run by our minds? The important part here, though, our definition, is this philosophical realism that focuses on the idea that our perception of the world around us is going to be produced by the information that's sent from our sensory organs. So, how we see the environment is entirely driven by the visual information that our eyes send to our brains. Now, this seems pretty logical. Yeah, we see the world through our eyes. So our eyes act almost like cameras to give us that interpretation of our environment. But as the semester goes on, we're going to see that there's actually some issues with this, and we can't quite take realism as our absolute truth. But to illustrate that, let's actually go to our next individual because that's going to help show this point. So our next person is Immanuel Kant, who says that we are born with some kind of innate knowledge of the world, and our experiences, the stuff we see in our environment as we go through life, those experiences add to that innate understanding that we start with. And we'll have some extra terms that tie into this momentarily, but the one we care about to go in contrast to realism is the idea of philosophical idealism. And here we say that our perception of the world is going to come from how our brain interprets that incoming sensory information. Now that seems really similar, but the important idea here is this interpretation. So this is saying that yes, we have incoming information, but our innate knowledge, the existing knowledge that we have of the world around us, is something that can shape and influence what it is that we're currently experiencing. Now, when we look at idealism, it's a lot more about the fact that the internal processes are the driving force, and what we're experiencing in the moment, that incoming sensory information, is very much secondary, and we're going to end up settling somewhere in the middle where, yes, we have important incoming sensory information, but our past experiences, things like our expectations, are going to influence how we interpret that information. And because that's a lot of very slightly modified but very similar statements. I'm going to give an example to try and show what I mean. So if you think of, what am I going to go with an example for? All right, let's say that you're walking past a billboard and you maybe glance at that billboard and you make some assumptions about what the billboard says because, hey, it's in the colors of some famous company. I guess we'll go with, say, a Pepsi billboard because Pepsi has a very visible logo. It's something that we've seen tons of. We know the blue color and the white circle and all of that. So without even reading a billboard, you know that it's for Pepsi. But maybe there's a sort of sketchy new company that's adopted the same colors and maybe a similar shape, but it's not quite the same. If you glanced at their knockoff billboard, if you didn't read it really closely, you'd still just interpret it as a Pepsi billboard. So our previous experience, that previous encounter with lots and lots of Pepsi branding, is something that's going to influence how you're seeing and interpreting that real life information. This is why sometimes you'll find yourself walking through an environment, say you're walking across campus or something, and maybe you almost pause and go, wait, what was it that I just saw? In the moment, you might have made some assumptions and sort of automatically categorized it as something, and then thought back on it and went, wait, it wasn't quite that. So in those cases, we can call it later on, our top-down interpretations, using those assumptions, can almost change what we think we're seeing. And again, it's a lot of words, but hopefully the examples helps to illustrate why this is something that we still care about, where that interpretation component is very important for our view of the world. And as we start getting into our later chapters, this is going to keep coming up, where our experiences with our environments is fairly subjective, meaning that each individual could technically be exposed to the same stimuli. You can hear the same sound or see the same visuals, but different individuals will interpret those slightly differently. Another example for that, we can interpret the same stimuli differently because of my background working with chickadees and specifically chickadee vocalizations. If you gave me a forest scene and you have bird song playing in the background, if there's chickadees there, I'm going to pick up on those and possibly pick up on those sounds at the expense of other sounds that I'd start to ignore. But somebody who hasn't been trained to listen to and interpret the nature of chickadee sounds might just listen to the whole thing without picking out any one sound. So different people will pick and choose what they pay attention to and assign different meaning based on that experience. So, okay. Lots of examples, hopefully that works, and explains that difference between this idealism, where that internal component can modify the physical sensory information coming in, versus realism that's all about just raw sensory information. And then to even add on that and hopefully clarify a little bit more, both of those concepts, both our realism and our idealism, tie into empiricism and nativism respectively. So philosophical empiricism is going to focus on the fact that our knowledge of the world is gained entirely through experience. So this is our idealistic definition. And this ties back to what we would call our British empiricists. And this is John Locke, along with George Berkeley and David Hume are the ones typically credited with this initial school of thought. But they really wanted to focus on how we intake sensory information, and by taking in that information, we learn about our environment. So I gave myself examples so I didn't have to come up with them on the fly. So if we have an empiricist view, we would say, I know that dogs are dangerous because I was bitten by one and it hurt. So I've learned now that I don't want to encounter dogs because they've hurt me in the past and they might hurt me again in the future. I experienced an event and that changed my knowledge of the world. In contrast, our philosophical nativism is going to say that our knowledge of the world is native, it's innate, it's something that is present from birth. And if we go to that idealistic extreme interpretation of this definition, we're saying that we are born with all of the sort of building blocks that we need, all of that base knowledge that we need to go out and interact with our environment. And my example, kind of similar to the dog one, is that we know that snakes are dangerous. Maybe because I recoil every time I encounter a snake. Even the first time I encountered a snake, before I knew that they could, or before my experience could tell me that they were dangerous, I drew back, I jumped away from this snake. So that can only come from innate knowledge, knowledge that I was born with. And as a little bit of an aside, we can actually see studies where people have this innate fear of snakes. So that gives us a little bit of hints that nativism is at least partially involved in human nature. And they know this because they've done studies where they expose people to either things like snakes or spiders, things that we have an innate fear of, and neutral things like trees and flowers. And it's actually a lot easier to get people to train up to have a startle response where they'll jump anytime they see a snake or a spider, but it's a lot harder to train them to jump when we show them a tree or a flower. And we can talk about more studies like that in the future, but it's kind of neat to see that, yeah, we do have some innate components, but it's not to the same extent as our sort of idealist nativism idea would have us think, where everything is something that we're born with. We aren't born with this sort of crippling fear of snakes. We're born with more an idea that snakes could be dangerous, and it's really easy for us to encounter one and build that fear because we have a predisposition. But what we have in reality is actually going to be a little bit of a combination of both. We do have some innate predispositions for certain aspects of human behavior, things like fears of snakes, but also things like being afraid of high places. We also have things like we are predisposed to respond to certain sounds, especially sounds that are similar to human languages. But we can also acknowledge the importance of the empirical gathering of knowledge to build on that innate predisposition. So when we talk about what we actually see with human behavior, it's going to be a combination of both innate components and active learning through experiencing things in our environment. So we acknowledge these starting points and these idealistic definitions, but we will also know that in the future, when we start talking about more modern stuff, it's not just one or the other. It's going to be a little bit of both.